You already know something is wrong. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that makes you want to flip tables or storm out of a building. More in the way that a sound bothers you. Low, persistent, just below the threshold of what you can name. And you have learned to live around it the way you learn to live around a draft in an old house. You find a way to sit that avoids it. You stop noticing, mostly. But it is always there. Maybe you felt it this morning. Maybe you felt it the moment you saw this title and something in your chest did a quiet thing. Not excitement exactly, more like recognition. The kind of recognition that comes not from learning something new, but from finally seeing something you have been carefully not looking at. That is where we are starting, right there, in that feeling. Because here is what most conversations about money and salary and career growth skip entirely. The facts are not the problem. You can read every negotiation guide ever written. You can know your market rate. You can have the data open in a tab on your browser right now. The salary surveys, the compensation benchmarks, the LinkedIn posts from people in your field who are making $30,000 more than you. The information is not what is missing. What is missing is something older than information, something that lives in the part of you that hesitates before you type a number into a form, that rehearses a conversation and then decides it is not the right time, that accepts an offer that feels low because the relief of having an offer feels bigger than the discomfort of pushing back. That tells yourself you will ask next year, and then next year arrives and finds you in the exact same position, a little more experienced, a little more tired, and somehow still not asking. This is not a book about tactics. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. There are plenty of books about tactics, how to anchor high, how to let silence do the work, how to frame a counteroffer so it lands softly. Those books are useful. Some of those tactics matter, but tactics applied to an unexamined self have a ceiling. They do not change the thing underneath. They teach you new moves inside an old identity, and after a while the old identity wins. You drift back, you shrink again. You call it being realistic and you move on. What this book is about is the thing underneath. It is about the quiet, persistent, entirely invisible architecture of how you came to believe, not think, believe, that you are worth a certain amount, that a certain kind of professional life is available to you and another kind is not, that pushing back is dangerous or arrogant or naive, that the people who get paid what they are worth are somehow different from you in a way you cannot quite name. They are not different. That is one of the things we are going to arrive at together, but we are not going to arrive at it through a list. We are going to arrive at it the way real understanding actually comes, through the slow, careful examination of how things got to be the way they are. You are going to recognize yourself in this, possibly uncomfortably so. That discomfort is the point. Not to make you feel bad, not to assign blame, but because you cannot change a pattern you have not clearly seen. And most people never see this one clearly because nobody talks about it this way. The conversation about being underpaid is usually either a pep talk or a political argument. It is either someone telling you to believe in yourself or someone telling you the system is rigged. Both of those things contain some truth. Neither of them is sufficient. What is sufficient is looking, really looking, at the specific, personal, deeply human reasons why someone as capable as you has been leaving money on the table, possibly for years. And then understanding what actually shifts when that changes. Not what you do differently, what you become differently. Because the people who finally close the gap between what they earn and what they are worth, and they exist, and they come from every background and every industry and every starting point. They do not just learn new behaviors. Something shifts in them first. Something quiet and foundational that changes the way they enter rooms, the way they talk about their work, the way they respond when someone underestimates them. That shift is what we are here to understand. We are going to go back before we go forward. That is the only way this works. We are going to find the first time you learned to make yourself smaller in conversations about money. We are going to look at the language you inherited, the beliefs you absorbed before you were old enough to question them, the moments that taught you what you were allowed to want. And then we are going to look at what it costs. Not abstractly, specifically. In dollars, in years, in versions of your life that quietly did not happen. And then, and only then, are we going to talk about what changes. Not because the journey backward is about suffering, but because the people who try to skip it almost always end up back where they started. They get the raise, and it feels smaller than expected. They land the new job, and within 18 months they are underpaid again. Because the pattern that created the original situation is still intact. The architecture is still there, running quietly in the background, doing its work. You cannot renovate a building while pretending the foundation is fine. So we start here. With the parking lot after the meeting, where you knew. The office after the phone call, where they gave you a number and you said thank you, and you felt something drop in your chest, and you told yourself it was enough, it was fine, you would figure it out. You have been figuring it out for a while now. Let's actually figure it out. There was a moment. There is always a moment. You might not remember it immediately. It is not usually dramatic. It does not announce itself as the day you learn to undervalue yourself. It arrives quietly, dressed as something else entirely. A comment from a parent, a correction from a teacher, a transaction that went a certain way and left a certain residue, and then it was over, and life continued, and you filed it somewhere you did not know you had, in a part of yourself that does not use language, that just knows. Most people, when they think about why they struggle to ask for more money, go looking in the obvious places. They think about their most recent job, their current boss, the culture of their industry, the economy. These things are real. They are not imaginary. But they are also not the beginning of the story. They are what the story arrived at, after years of something quieter shaping the ground beneath it. Go back further. Think about the first time money was discussed in your home. Not the content of what was said, whether there was a lot of it or a little of it, but the texture of those conversations. Was money talked about openly, or did it carry a kind of weight that made the air in the room change? Was it a source of anxiety, gripped tightly and never examined? Was it something other people had and your family didn't? And was there a feeling attached to that, resentment or shame, or a kind of stoic pride in not needing it too much? Was wanting more considered greedy? Was ambition celebrated or quietly suspect? Was there someone in your family who made good money, and how was that person talked about when they were not in the room? These are not rhetorical questions. They are archaeological ones, because the answers to them built something in you long before you ever sat across from a hiring manager, long before you ever had to decide whether to accept an offer or push back on it. Children are extraordinarily good observers and extraordinarily bad interpreters. They see everything and understand very little of what they see. They fill in the gaps with the only material available to them, themselves. So if money was stressful in your household, you did not conclude that money is complicated. You concluded something more personal. That wanting money causes problems, that people who have too much of it are not like us, that the correct relationship to financial ambition is one of careful restraint. Or perhaps the lesson was different. Perhaps money was absent, and the adults around you worked constantly and were still behind, and what you absorbed was not restraint, but futility. That working hard and having enough were not as connected as people claimed. That a certain ceiling existed, and people like your family lived beneath it, and that was simply the shape of the world. Neither of these childhoods produces a person who walks easily into a salary negotiation and asks for what they deserve. One produces a person who feels guilty for wanting more. The other produces a person who doesn't believe more is actually available. Both of them produce the same result, a number left on the table. Here is the part that matters most, and the part that is hardest to sit with. These early lessons were not given to you by careless people in most cases. They were given to you by people who were themselves operating from what they had absorbed. Your parents, or whoever raised you, taught you about money and worth and ambition from within their own unexamined architecture. They passed down not just values, but wounds, not just beliefs, but the rooms those beliefs were built in. This is not about blame. I want to say that clearly. This section of the journey is not an invitation to be angry at the people who raised you. Anger at them is another way of staying stuck, another way of locating the problem outside yourself where you cannot actually change it. This is about seeing, just seeing. The way you might look at an old photograph and understand for the first time why a certain expression is on a certain face. But there is something else, something beyond the family, beyond the home. School did its own work on this. Think about how achievement was rewarded in the classrooms you grew up in. Think about what happened to the kid who raised their hand confidently, who asked for more, who said out loud that they were good at something. In some rooms, that was celebrated. In many rooms, in most rooms, if we are being honest, it was treated with a particular kind of social skepticism. Who do you think you are? Don't get too big for your britches. Nobody likes someone who thinks too highly of themselves. Humility was taught as a virtue, and humility is a virtue. But somewhere in the transmission, for a lot of people, it got tangled with something else. It got tangled with smallness, with preemptive apology, with the habit of downplaying competence before anyone else could challenge it, because challenge felt dangerous. Because standing fully in what you were capable of felt like a risk that the social environment around you did not seem to sanction. And then you grew up, and you brought all of that with you. Into every interview, every performance review, every moment when someone asked you what you were looking for in terms of compensation, and something in your body tightened, and you gave a number that felt safe. Safe. That is the word that matters here. Not true, not accurate, not reflective of what you actually bring. Safe. The first time you shrunk, you were not making a financial decision. You were making a survival decision in the vocabulary available to a young person navigating a world that had taught them specific things about what was allowed. The problem is that survival decisions made at 10 or 14 or 22 do not automatically update when you are 35 and sitting in a conference room with a job offer in front of you. They just run, quietly, doing what they were built to do, until you see them. Pay attention to how you talk about your work. Not in a performance review, not when you are trying to impress someone, in the ordinary moments, when a friend asks what you do, when a family member at a holiday table asks how things are going at the job, when someone at a networking event asks what you bring to the table and you feel the familiar pull to soften it, to hedge it, to add a small disclaimer at the end so it doesn't sound like you think too highly of yourself. Listen to the language, because the language is a map. People who are chronically underpaid do not use the same vocabulary around their work as people who are paid what they are worth. And the difference is not confidence in the performative sense. It is not volume or swagger or the ability to dominate a room. The difference is subtler than that. It lives in the small words, the qualifiers, the reflexive minimizations that happen so fast you barely notice them. I'm just an analyst. I only manage a small team. It's nothing too impressive, but I've been doing some work on, and then the work, buried beneath 3 layers of pre-apology. Just, only, nothing too impressive. These are not humility. They are a tax you pay on your own value before anyone else gets the chance to question it. They are a way of beating the critic to the punch, of controlling the narrative by shrinking it first. Here is what that language does in a professional context. When you minimize your work before presenting it, you are not being endearing. You are training the people around you in how to think about you. You are giving them a number before the negotiation starts. You are telling them quietly but clearly that you do not believe you are worth full price, and so they should not be expected to offer it. Most people in positions of hiring and compensation are not predatory. They are not sitting across from you rubbing their hands together, hoping you'll undersell yourself. They are busy, and they are taking their cues from you. And if the cue you give them is one of tentativeness, of smallness, of someone who seems grateful just to be considered, they will respond accordingly, not out of malice, out of information. You gave them the information. You gave it to them in the first 30 seconds. Now think about the language around money itself. When someone asks what you're looking for in terms of salary, what is the internal experience that immediately precedes your answer? For most underpaid professionals, there is a cascade, a quick internal calculation that is not really a calculation at all. It is more like a negotiation between 2 parts of themselves, the part that knows what the market pays and the part that does not quite believe it applies to them. So they split the difference. They ask for something between what they deserve and what feels safe, and they call it being reasonable. Being reasonable, another phrase worth examining. Because in the context of salary conversations, reasonable almost never means accurately calibrated to the market. It means acceptable to the room. It means unlikely to cause discomfort. It means a number that will not make the other person's expression shift in a way that might mean rejection. The fear underneath reasonable is the fear of the shifted expression, the slight pause, the intake of breath on the other side of the table that might mean you have asked for too much, that you have misread the situation, that you have revealed a belief about your own worth that the other person does not share. That fear is ancient. You recognize it from before the conference room. It is the same fear that made you downplay your test score in front of the kid who didn't do as well. The same fear that made you laugh off a compliment before you could be caught fully accepting it. The same fear that learned a long time ago that standing fully in your own value was a social risk. And so the language adapted, became careful, became preemptively small. There is another layer to this, and it is the one that tends to surprise people when they first see it. It is not just the language directed outward toward bosses, interviewers, colleagues. It is the language directed inward. The private monologue around money and worth that runs constantly beneath the surface of daily professional life. What do you say to yourself when you see a job listing that pays significantly more than you make? Do you click it with the assumption that you are a candidate? Or does some part of your internal voice immediately begin building a case for why you are probably not quite there yet? Why your resume has this gap, or your experience in this one area is thin, or you would need to do a few more years at your current level before you could really justify applying. That internal voice is not a neutral assessor. It is not giving you an accurate reading of your qualifications. It is giving you a reading filtered through every lesson you ever absorbed about what you are allowed to want and what category of professional life belongs to people like you. It is extraordinarily convincing. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like the reasonable voice that keeps you from embarrassing yourself. But here is what it actually is. It is the first moment of every negotiation you will ever have, happening entirely inside your own head before anyone else is even in the room. And you are losing it, every time, before a single word is spoken. The language you use about your work and your worth is not a symptom of being underpaid. It is a mechanism of it. It is one of the primary ways the pattern sustains itself, not through external forces, but through the daily, quiet, almost invisible practice of talking yourself into your own ceiling. Hearing it is the first disruption, because you cannot change what you cannot hear. And most people have been speaking this language for so long, it stopped sounding like a choice and started sounding like the truth. It is not the truth. It is a habit. And habits, once seen clearly, are never quite as permanent as they seemed. Someone at some point taught you that being grateful meant being quiet. Not in those words. It was never said in those words. It arrived sideways, the way the most durable lessons always do. It arrived in the form of a comment after you complained about something at work. At least you have a job. Or in the way a parent talked about their own career with a kind of resigned appreciation for what they had been given rather than curiosity about what they might have pursued. It arrived in the cultural water, in the general atmosphere of a certain kind of professional advice that has been handed to young people for decades. Be grateful for the opportunity, work hard, prove yourself, and good things will come. That is not entirely wrong advice. Gratitude is real. Opportunity matters. Hard work is not optional. But somewhere in that transmission, for a lot of people, gratitude got quietly weaponized. It became the ceiling. It became the reason not to ask. It became the internal argument that activated every time ambition surfaced. You have so much already. Who are you to want more? Do you know how many people would be grateful to be in your position? And so you stayed. Or you didn't ask. Or you asked in that apologetic, tentative way that signals you don't really believe you deserve a yes. And you got a no, and some part of you felt it confirmed something you already suspected about yourself. Here is the thing about gratitude that the weaponized version leaves out. Genuine gratitude and genuine ambition are not opposites. They are not in tension. You can be deeply, authentically grateful for what you have and simultaneously clear-eyed about the fact that you are not being paid what your work is worth. Those two things can exist in the same person, in the same moment, without contradiction. But the weaponized version cannot hold both. The weaponized version is binary. Either you are grateful, meaning still, accepting, not pushing, or you are ungrateful, which is to say difficult, which is to say the kind of person who doesn't appreciate what they have, which is to say the kind of person nobody wants to keep around. That binary is a trap, and an enormous number of talented, capable, genuinely hard-working professionals are living inside it right now. Think about how this plays out in a specific workplace scenario. You have been in your role for 2 years. You have taken on responsibilities that were not in your original job description. You have solved problems that your predecessor couldn't. You have quietly become indispensable in ways that everyone around you can see, but no one has formally acknowledged. And you know that your salary has not kept pace with what you are actually doing. You think about bringing it up, you rehearse the conversation, and then something activates. A voice that sounds remarkably like wisdom, but is actually something older and more defensive. It says, they are already giving you so much. The flexibility, the environment, the people you work with. The fact that they trust you with these projects means something. Money isn't everything. Being known as someone who just works hard and doesn't make waves, that's worth something too. Be patient. Be grateful. Your time will come. And another year passes. This is not a hypothetical. This is the professional biography of millions of people who are, by any objective measure, excellent at what they do. People whose performance reviews are strong, whose colleagues respect them, whose managers rely on them, and who are still quietly being underpaid because the gratitude framework they internalized long ago makes it nearly impossible to advocate for themselves without feeling like they are doing something wrong. There is a particular cruelty in this dynamic that I want to name directly. The people most susceptible to the weaponized gratitude trap are often the most conscientious, the most loyal, the most genuinely invested in their work and their organizations. They are not the cynical clock watchers who have already emotionally checked out. They are the people who care deeply, who take pride in what they do, who feel genuine connection to the mission or the team or the craft. And it is precisely that care that gets used against them. Because caring deeply makes the social cost of disruption feel higher, because someone who genuinely loves their work has more to lose, emotionally, from a conversation that goes badly. Because the person who is merely collecting a paycheck can ask for more without much internal resistance, they have less attachment to the outcome. But the person who has wrapped their identity around being good at what they do, who has made their professional relationships meaningful, who shows up every day with real investment, that person has everything to lose from a conversation that might change how they are seen. So they don't have it. And the organization, not out of malice, just out of the basic logic of institutional resource management, responds to what it is shown. It is shown someone who is satisfied. It is shown someone who is performing excellently without complaint. It is shown someone who, by all available signals, is fine with the current arrangement. And so the current arrangement continues. This is the mechanism that nobody talks about when they talk about the gender pay gap, or the loyalty penalty, or why high performers sometimes end up earning less than their more vocal, more mobile counterparts. It is not always bias, though bias exists. It is not always exploitation, though exploitation exists. Sometimes it is simply this. One person believes that asking is incompatible with gratitude, and another person does not hold that belief. And over time, the compounding difference in their outcomes looks like luck or favoritism or some mysterious quality the first person can't quite identify. It is not mysterious, it is not luck, it is a belief, a single, inherited, largely unexamined belief about what gratitude requires of you. And beliefs, unlike circumstances, can be changed, not instantly, not by reading a paragraph and deciding to feel differently, but through the slow, careful work of examination, of holding a belief up to the light and asking whether it is actually true or whether it is simply old and familiar and has been running so long it forgot it was ever a choice. Gratitude was never supposed to mean silence. It was never supposed to mean still. Let's talk about a number, not your salary, a different number. Take what you are currently earning. Hold it in your mind. Now ask yourself how long you have been earning approximately that amount, within, say, 15 to 20% of where you are today. For most people reading this, the honest answer is longer than they want to admit. 3 years, 5 years. In some cases, a decade or more of incremental adjustments that never quite caught up to the market, to inflation, to the expanding scope of what they actually do. Now, do the math nobody does. Not the math of what you earn, the math of the gap. The difference between what you earn and what your role, your experience, your output, and your market actually warrant. For many professionals, that gap, conservatively estimated, is somewhere between 10 and 30% of their current salary. Some people, when they finally look honestly, find it is larger than that. Take the conservative number. Say the gap is $15,000 a year. That feels abstract, so make it concrete. $15,000 a year is $15,000 a year for every year you have been in that gap. If you have been underpaid by that margin for 5 years, you have not lost $15,000. You have lost $75,000 in 5 years. That is not a rounding error. That is a car. That is a down payment. That is a year of a child's college tuition. That is the emergency fund that would have meant the last crisis didn't become a debt that is still with you. But the number that truly changes people, when they finally let themselves see it, is not the 5-year number. It is the compounding number. Because the money you did not earn was not just money you did not have. It was money that did not sit in a retirement account growing over 30 years. It was money that did not go into an investment that doubled. It was money that did not reduce the debt you are still paying interest on, which means the effective cost of the gap is not just the gap itself. It is the gap plus the interest on the debt you carried because the gap existed, plus the growth you did not capture because the money was never there to grow. Compounding works in both directions. Everyone learns about compounding as the miracle of investing, the way small amounts grow into large amounts over time given enough patience. What fewer people talk about is compounding in reverse. The way a gap, sustained over years, does not just add, it multiplies. The way being underpaid at 32 has a different cost than being underpaid at 52, because at 32 the money has 30 years to compound into something, and at 52 it has 10, and the difference between those two trajectories is not proportional, it is exponential. This is the invisible math. The math that does not appear on your pay stub. The math that does not come up in your performance review. The math that nobody sits you down and walks you through, because nobody in your professional life has a structural incentive to show it to you. Your employer benefits from you not doing this math, not because they are villainous, because organizations, like all systems, tend toward the path of least resistance, and an employee who does not ask is an employee who costs less. The path of least resistance for you has a price, and you have been paying it, quietly, for years. Here is where this gets more personal. The financial gap is real, and the compounding cost is real, and both of those things matter enormously. But there is another cost that does not show up in any calculation, and it is in some ways more insidious than the dollar figure. It is the cost of what you did not do because the money was not there. The certification you did not pursue because the out-of-pocket cost felt too high. The city you did not move to because you could not absorb the transition costs. The 6 months you did not take between jobs to build the thing you have been thinking about building because your financial cushion was too thin to make that kind of risk survivable. The version of your career that required a certain kind of stability you never quite had because the gap was always present, always applying its quiet pressure, always narrowing the options that were theoretically available to you. Underpayment is not just a financial condition. It is a constraint on possibility. It limits the moves you can make, the risks you can take, the investments in yourself that would have compounded in their own right, in skill, in network, in the kind of confidence that comes from having made a bet on yourself and survived it. And here is the part that tends to land hardest, when people finally let themselves sit with it. The gap was not inevitable. It was not the result of a fixed and immovable reality. It was the result of a series of moments, each one small, each one feeling reasonable at the time, in which something was accepted that did not have to be accepted, in which a number was not pushed back on, in which a conversation was rehearsed and then not had. Each of those moments felt like a minor choice. None of them felt like the compounding of a $75,000 loss. That is how it works. That is why it is so hard to see in real time, because in real time you are not choosing between your current salary and a correct salary. You are choosing between comfort and discomfort, between the relief of not rocking the boat and the anxiety of an uncertain conversation, between the familiar and the unknown. And comfort wins almost every time when that is the frame. But the frame is wrong. The real choice was never between comfort and discomfort. It was between the short-term relief of avoiding one hard conversation and the long-term cost of a gap that compounds silently, year after year, doing its quiet arithmetic in the background of your life while you convince yourself it is not that bad. It will work out. Next year will be different. The math does not care about next year. It is already running. There is a story that gets told about success in professional life, and it goes something like this. Become excellent at what you do, and the rewards will follow. Work hard, develop your skills, deliver results, be the person everyone can count on, and the recognition, the title, the compensation will come, because merit is eventually rewarded and competence eventually rises. It is a generous story. It is also, in its most important detail, incomplete. Because competence and compensation are not the same system. They interact sometimes in certain environments, under certain conditions, but they are not the same thing, do not operate by the same rules, and do not respond to the same inputs. And the professionals who spend years pouring energy into one while expecting it to automatically produce the other are the ones who end up, at some point, staring at a salary that does not reflect what they actually do, wondering what they missed. What they missed is this. Being good at your job is the entry requirement. It is not the negotiation. Think about the people you have worked with over the years, the ones who are genuinely, observably excellent, the ones who solve the problems nobody else can solve, who make the work better simply by being in the room, who carry more than their share without complaint, and deliver consistently and without drama. Now think about whether those people are uniformly the highest paid people in your organization. They are not. You know they are not. Some of them are. But some of the highest paid people you have encountered are not the most competent. They are the most visible, the most vocal about their contributions, the most skilled at the particular art of making sure the right people understand what they bring, the most comfortable in the specific conversation where value is declared and defended and negotiated. That is a different skill, entirely separate from competence, and for a long time it was treated as somehow distasteful to acknowledge that this skill exists and matters, because acknowledging it seems to undermine the meritocracy story, seems to suggest that the game is not entirely fair, seems to reward something other than pure excellence. But ignoring it does not make it go away. It just means you are playing a game without understanding its rules. Here is what is actually happening in most organizations, beneath the surface of performance reviews and compensation discussions. Value is not automatically visible. It has to be communicated. Contributions that are not articulated tend not to be fully counted. The person who does the most and says the least is, from a purely informational standpoint, indistinguishable from the person who does slightly less with slightly more documentation. The manager allocating raises is working with incomplete information always, and the information they have access to is heavily weighted toward what has been made visible. This is not a conspiracy. It is the basic limitation of human attention in complex organizations. Nobody is tracking everything. Nobody has perfect visibility into every contribution. The people who understand this, and who take responsibility for making their value legible rather than assuming it will be noticed, end up better compensated, not because they are more competent, but because they have understood that communication is not separate from performance. It is part of it. There is a particular type of professional who finds this realization deeply uncomfortable. They tend to be people who pride themselves on the quality of their work, who believe, genuinely, and with some justification, that the work should speak for itself. who find the act of advocating for their own contributions slightly distasteful, too close to bragging, too close to the behavior of people they have observed and quietly judged as all talk and no substance. That discomfort is understandable. It is also expensive, because the work does not speak for itself. The work sits there, excellent and mute, while other conversations happen in other rooms. While someone who understands the second game, the visibility game, the communication game, the game of making value legible, is having those conversations and being responded to accordingly. And here is the layer beneath that. The discomfort with self-advocacy is not random, it is not evenly distributed. It tends to cluster in specific populations, people who were taught that talking about their achievements was boastful, that letting work speak for itself was noble, that the right kind of person waits to be recognized rather than seeking recognition. These lessons were absorbed early. They feel like character rather than conditioning. They feel like who you are rather than what you were taught. But they have a cost, and the cost shows up in the gap between your output and your income year after year in the organizations that were more than willing to let you believe the meritocracy story while quietly rewarding the people who understood the fuller picture. Now, and this is important, none of this means that the solution is to become someone you are not. It does not mean you need to become loud or performative or the kind of person who takes credit for things they did not do. The people who overcorrect in that direction tend to create a different set of problems entirely, and their careers have their own particular ceilings. What it means is something more nuanced than that. It means understanding that advocating for your own value is not the opposite of integrity. It means recognizing that making your contributions visible is not bragging. It is information sharing, in a context where information is what decisions are made from. It means accepting that the conversation about what you are worth is not an interruption to your professional life. It is a core part of it. Competence got you to the room. It will keep you in the room, but it will not, on its own, determine what you are paid for being there. That is a different conversation. One that requires a different set of skills. Skills that can be learned, but only by people who have first accepted that they are necessary. Most people spend their entire careers waiting for their excellence to be discovered. The ones who get paid what they are worth stopped waiting. At some point, the salary stops being just a number. It becomes something else, something more personal than a figure on a pay stub, more loaded than a market rate, more tangled than a simple transaction between employer and employee. It becomes a kind of verdict, a quarterly assessment of how much space you are allowed to take up in the world, an external confirmation or contradiction of something you have been carrying internally for a long time about what you are worth. This is where the conversation about underpayment stops being about money and starts being about identity. And it is, without question, the most important layer of all of this. Because you can understand the compounding math and still not ask. You can recognize the visibility gap and still not speak. You can know intellectually every single thing we have covered so far, and still find yourself accepting a number that doesn't reflect your value. Because somewhere beneath the intellect, a deeper part of you is not yet convinced that a different number is actually available to someone like you. Someone like you, that phrase, notice it. Because that phrase is doing an enormous amount of quiet work in the professional lives of underpaid people. It is the phrase that turns a negotiation into an identity test. It is the phrase that makes asking for more feel not like a business conversation, but like a referendum on whether you belong in a certain category of professional life, and more fundamentally, whether you deserve to. Think about the last time you were offered a salary that felt low, or the last time you knew your current compensation was below market. What happened in your body in that moment? Not what you thought, what you felt. Because the body responds to these moments in ways the mind is often too busy rationalizing to notice. For many people, the physical experience of being underpaid or of contemplating asking for more has a particular quality. A tightening, a kind of bracing, as if for impact, a warmth in the face that has nothing to do with temperature. These are not random physiological events. They are the body's response to a perceived threat. And the threat being perceived is not financial. It is social. It is the ancient, deeply wired fear of being seen as too much. of reaching and being told no, of the no meaning something about you that goes beyond this particular job, this particular number, this particular moment. The no that underpaid people fear is never just a no about money. It is a no about whether they were right about themselves, whether the version of themselves they have been quietly, carefully, hopefully constructing, the one that is worth more, that belongs at the next level, that has been working towards something real, is actually true. And if the answer comes back no, it does not feel like a negotiating position. It feels like confirmation of the oldest fear. That fear is the reason people accept the first offer. Stay in the underpaying job longer than they should. Avoid the conversation that might change things. It is not laziness. It is not ignorance. It is the protection of something fragile, the belief that they might be worth more, by never actually testing it. Because if you never test it, you never have to find out. And there is a particular, painful irony embedded in this dynamic. The very act of protecting the belief by not testing it is what ensures the belief can never become real. You cannot grow into a larger sense of your own professional worth while simultaneously refusing every situation that would require you to claim it. The identity has to be practiced before it feels true. The ask has to happen before the yes can come. The discomfort has to be entered before the other side of it becomes accessible. But the sequence feels backward from the inside. From the inside, it feels like you should feel worthy before you ask. Like the confidence should come first, and the action should follow naturally from it. Like there is some internal threshold you need to cross, some sufficient accumulation of self-belief, before it becomes appropriate to behave like someone who knows their value. That threshold does not exist, or more precisely, it exists, but it is not crossed by waiting. It is crossed by acting, repeatedly, in the direction of the person you are trying to become before that person feels fully real. The first time you ask for what you actually deserve, it will not feel natural. It will feel like a performance, like you are playing a character who is more certain than you actually are, like someone is going to look through the performance and see the uncertainty beneath it and call you out. They will not. Because the uncertainty beneath the performance is invisible to everyone but you. Because the person across the table is not reading your internal state with the accuracy your anxiety assumes. Because competence and self-advocacy, when they occur together, land as confidence, regardless of what is happening internally. And after the first time, it is slightly easier. Not easy. Slightly easier. And after the fifth time, it is different again. And somewhere along that road, something that started as a performance becomes a posture. And then the posture becomes a position. And then the position becomes, quietly and without announcement, who you actually are. This is the shift people describe when they talk about finally understanding their value. Not a sudden revelation. Not a morning they woke up and everything was different. A slow, practice-built, imperfect, occasionally uncomfortable accumulation of moments in which they chose the person they were becoming over the person they had been. The salary was never just a number. It was always a mirror. And what it reflects is not fixed. Every negotiation begins before anyone speaks. It begins in the parking lot, or the elevator, or the quiet moment in a bathroom before you walk into the room. It begins in the way you carry yourself through the door, in the first 3 seconds of eye contact, in whether you sit down as someone who has arrived or someone who has been permitted entry. In all of the non-verbal, pre-verbal, entirely human signaling that happens before a single number is mentioned, and that, by the time a number is mentioned, has already done most of the work. This is not motivational language. This is the basic mechanics of how human beings assess each other, running beneath the professional surface of every compensation conversation ever had. We are social animals with ancient hardware. We read status, confidence, and self-assessment in milliseconds through channels that bypass the rational mind entirely. And the read we get from those channels shapes every subsequent judgment, including what feels like a reasonable number to offer or to accept. Which means that negotiation, real negotiation, the kind that changes outcomes rather than just introduces an uncomfortable moment before the original number is accepted anyway, starts with how you have already decided to show up. Not what you are going to say, who you are going to be in the room. Most people, when they think about negotiation, think about the words, the right phrase, the right counter, the right way to frame a number so it lands without creating friction. And those things matter. Language matters. But language in service of an uncertain self is like a good argument delivered in a whisper. The content can be correct and still not land because the delivery has already told the room something the words are now trying to contradict. Let's look at what is actually happening beneath the surface of a salary conversation. Because most people experience it as a transaction, a discussion of numbers with a practical outcome, when it is actually something considerably more layered than that. When you walk into a negotiation, both parties are doing something that looks like discussing compensation, but is actually a process of establishing relative position. The person on the other side of the table is not only calculating whether the number you have asked for fits within their budget and their internal pay bands. They are also, unconsciously, automatically, in the ancient mammalian part of their brain that never stopped doing this, assessing whether you believe you are worth what you are asking for. And here is what that assessment is based on. Not your resume. They have already read your resume. Not your answers to the questions they asked. Those are processed through the rational mind and carry only a fraction of the weight. The assessment is based on something far more primal, on whether the person in front of them seems fully at home in the ask, whether there is a dissonance between the number being stated and the body stating it, whether the energy in the room after the number lands suggests someone who is bracing for rejection or someone who is simply presenting a fact. That dissonance is detectable, not always consciously. But the slight over-explanation after stating a number, the instinct to justify and soften and add layers of context before anyone has pushed back, communicates something. The quick retreat from a counter that had barely been challenged communicates something. The apologetic tone that creeps into language when money is being discussed directly communicates something. All of those things say, I am not entirely sure I deserve this. And once that signal is in the room, it does most of the other side's work for them. So what does it look like from the other direction? What does it look like when someone enters the room who has done the internal work, who has not manufactured false confidence, but who has genuinely reckoned with their value and arrived at a settled relationship with what they are asking for? It looks quiet. That is the first thing. It does not look like aggression or bravado or the kind of performative certainty that reads as overcompensation. It looks like someone who is having a normal conversation about a factual matter, who states a number the way they would state any other relevant piece of information, clearly without apology, without the trailing justifications that signal doubt, who listens to the response without the internal collapse that turns a first counter into a final answer, who understands that silence after a number lands is not rejection. It is thinking, and thinking is good, and the instinct to fill that silence with concessions is one of the most expensive instincts in professional life. The pause after you state your number is sacred. Fill it, and you have negotiated against yourself. Hold it, and you have communicated something about your relationship to the ask that no words could have conveyed. There are practical things that matter in negotiation. Knowing your number before you walk in, not a range, a number, because a range tells the other side exactly where to land, and it is never on the high end. Understanding the full landscape of what is being negotiated, because salary is one dimension of a compensation structure that includes equity, flexibility, title, scope, review timelines, and a dozen other variables that have real value. Knowing what the market actually pays, not what you have been paid, because those two numbers are often not the same conversation. But beneath all of the tactics, beneath the specific language and the research and the strategic timing, beneath all of it is the question of whether you have actually decided before you walk into the room that you are worth what you are asking for. Not hoping you are. Not performing the belief while doubting it underneath. Actually decided. That decision is not made in the negotiation. It is made in the weeks and months before it, in the quiet, ongoing work of understanding your value clearly enough that stating it does not require courage, it simply requires honesty. Negotiation is not a confrontation. It is not an imposition. It is not the aggressive act that the fear around it implies. It is a conversation between two parties who both need something, conducted most effectively by the person who has already resolved, privately and completely, that what they are bringing to the table is worth exactly what they are saying it is worth. That resolution is available to you. It was always available to you. The shift, when it comes, is not loud. That is the first thing to understand about it, and possibly the most important, because the way transformation gets depicted, in the stories we tell about it, in the cultural mythology around breakthrough moments, almost always involves drama. A confrontation, a firing, a rock bottom, a single conversation that changed everything. A morning someone woke up and decided, finally and completely, that things were going to be different. Sometimes it happens that way, but more often, for the kind of deep, durable shift we have been building toward in this conversation, it arrives quietly. It arrives in a moment that does not announce itself as significant. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary week, during an ordinary interaction, and it is only later, sometimes much later, that you look back and recognize it as the place where something turned. It might be a conversation where someone makes an offhand comment about what your role should be paying, and instead of the usual internal response, the deflection, the minimization, the quick calculation of why that number probably doesn't apply to you, something in you simply agrees, not dramatically, not with a rush of emotion, just quietly, clearly, without resistance. Yes, that is approximately right. That is approximately what this work is worth. And I have not been receiving it. No thunder, no revelation. Just a fact, landing cleanly, without the usual cushioning of self-doubt. Or it might arrive in a meeting where someone takes credit for something you did, a pattern you have watched without reacting to for years. And this time, calmly, without anger, without performance, you simply correct the record. You say what actually happened. You do it in the same tone you would use to note that a meeting has been moved, and you do not spend the rest of the day second-guessing yourself, and you do not apologize for it afterward. Or it might arrive in the moment before you submit an application for a role that pays considerably more than you currently make, and the usual cascade of internal objections begins, the not quite yet, the maybe in another year, the who do I think I am. And instead of following the cascade to its familiar conclusion, you notice it. You see it for what it is. An old pattern running on old data, trying to protect you from a risk that is no longer as large as it once was, in a landscape that has changed considerably since the pattern was written. And you submit the application anyway, not because the fear is gone, the fear is still there, but because you have begun to understand the relationship between the fear and the action differently. You have begun to understand that the fear is not a signal that you are wrong. It is a signal that you are moving. And moving, even when uncomfortable, is exactly what this moment requires. This is what the shift actually feels like from the inside, not the absence of doubt, but a changed relationship to it, not the disappearance of the old voice, but a growing ability to hear it without obeying it, the voice that says, you are not quite ready, not quite deserving, not quite the kind of person who gets to ask for that. It does not go silent, but it begins to sound like what it always was, an echo of someone else's limitation, absorbed long ago, still running in borrowed territory. And here is something that surprises people when they first experience this shift. The external world responds to it faster than they expected, not because the world is magical, not because intention produces outcomes through some mysterious mechanism, but because the shift changes behavior in ways that are visible to other people, even when it feels invisible from the inside. The person who has done this internal work carries themselves differently in rooms, not arrogantly, not loudly, but with a quality of settledness that communicates something the other ancient mammalian hardware in the room picks up immediately. They speak about their work differently, not with more volume, but with more precision, more ownership, less reflexive apology. They respond to lowball offers differently, not with indignation, but with a kind of calm that implies the offer is interesting information rather than a verdict. And organizations, which are, at their core, collections of human beings reading each other constantly, respond to that settledness. Opportunities surface. Conversations happen that did not happen before. People who previously assumed a certain ceiling was acceptable begin to discover that the ceiling was never structural. It was relational. It was based on what they had communicated over time about what they expected. When the communication changes, the relationship changes. And when the relationship changes, the outcomes change. Not always immediately, not always in the current organization, which sometimes has too much invested in the previous version of you to easily accommodate the new one. But in the broader arc of a career, the shift compounds. In the same way that underearning compounded silently in one direction for years, the corrected trajectory compounds in the other. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the way that all real change actually moves. There is something else that happens in this shift that is harder to quantify, but may ultimately be the most significant part of it. The relationship to work itself changes. When you are chronically underpaid, there is a particular kind of ambient resentment that tends to develop. Not always conscious, not always named, but present. A low-grade friction between the effort you are giving and the recognition you are receiving that slowly, over time, erodes something. The enthusiasm that was once genuine becomes partly performed. The investment that was once natural becomes partly strategic. The love of the work, if it was ever there, gets gradually complicated by the feeling of not being seen clearly. When the gap closes, not just financially, but in the deeper sense of being recognized for what you actually bring, something in that relationship to work shifts too. There is less weight in it, less of the particular exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from hard work that feels invisible. You do not just earn more, you work differently, you show up differently, you bring something to the work that the previous version of you, carrying the weight of the unclosed gap, could not quite access. That is what is on the other side of this. Not just a number, a way of being in your professional life that was always possible and is now, finally, beginning. There is a version of you that already exists somewhere ahead of where you are standing right now. Not a fantasy version. Not an airbrushed, everything went perfectly version, a real one. Flawed, still figuring things out, still navigating the ordinary friction of professional life, but fundamentally different in one specific way. That version of you has stopped shrinking. Not in a dramatic, proclaimed way. Not with a declaration or a manifesto or a moment of cinematic resolve. Just quietly, gradually, through the accumulation of small decisions made differently, that version of you has stopped making themselves smaller as a default. And the downstream effects of that single change are larger than most people allow themselves to imagine. Think about what changes when someone stops undervaluing themselves, not just in salary negotiations, but in the texture of their daily professional life. They stop volunteering for the work that nobody sees and nobody credits, not because they become selfish, but because they begin to distinguish between contribution and invisibility. They stop over-explaining their decisions to people who were never actually questioning them. They stop interpreting silence as disapproval. They stop arriving at meetings slightly apologetic for taking up space and start arriving as someone who has something to offer the room, which, to be clear, they always did. The difference is that now they know it, and the knowing changes how it lands. The relationships change too. This surprises people. They expect the financial shift, or they at least anticipate it as a possibility. They do not always expect the relational one. But when you stop operating from a position of proving your worth, constantly, subtly, exhaustingly, something opens in the way you relate to other people professionally. You become less reactive to perceived slights, because the slight no longer threatens the fragile architecture of your self-assessment. You become more genuinely generous with credit and recognition for others, because you are no longer in a scarcity relationship with acknowledgement. You become, paradoxically, easier to work with. Not harder, not more demanding, because the anxiety that made you difficult to read has quieted. The people around you respond to this. Colleagues who previously saw someone capable but somehow uncertain begin to see someone grounded. Managers who previously assumed a certain passivity begin to receive clear, direct communication about contributions and expectations. The invisible negotiation that happens in every professional relationship, the ongoing calibration of how people see each other and what they are owed, begins to recalibrate in your favor, not because you have become more aggressive, but because you have become more legible, more fully present, more completely yourself. And the financial reality, which is what brought most people to this conversation in the first place, follows from all of that. Not always in the current job, not always in the current organization, not always on the timeline you would choose, but follow it does, because compensation is, beneath all of its complexity and politics and structural inequity, a reflection of perceived value. And perceived value is a function of communicated value. And communicated value is inseparable from the internal relationship you have with your own worth. When that relationship changes, everything downstream of it changes too. Now, there is something I want to say directly to the part of you that has been listening to all of this and feeling something between recognition and resistance. The part that can hear the truth of it and still feel the pull of the familiar. The part that knows the old pattern is expensive and still finds it difficult to imagine fully leaving it behind. That part of you is not your enemy. It built something real. It kept you safe in environments where safety was genuinely necessary. It developed a kind of intelligence about the social landscape of professional life that, even if it overshot in the direction of smallness, came from a real place of observation and adaptation. You do not need to be at war with it. You just need to stop letting it make decisions for you. Because the environment that built the pattern is not the environment you are in now. You are not the age you were when those early lessons landed. You are not in the same room, with the same people, with the same stakes. The risk of asking for what you are worth is not the risk it once was. Or if it is, you have more resources to survive it than you did then. The person who would be rejected is not the person who could not afford to be rejected. You have built something since then. You have become something since then. And the old pattern, running on old data, has not caught up with who you actually are. That is the gap at the center of this entire conversation. Not the gap between your salary and the market rate, though that gap is real. The deeper gap, the one that generates and sustains the financial one, is the gap between who you have become and how you still, in certain moments, insist on presenting yourself. Closing that gap is the work. And it is not a single act, it is a practice. A daily, imperfect, ongoing practice of choosing the more accurate version of yourself in moments when the less accurate one feels safer. Of stating your value without apology when every old instinct is reaching for the qualifier. Of holding the pause after the number lands when every nerve in your body is suggesting you fill it. Of applying for the role that feels slightly out of reach and discovering, as so many people before you have discovered, that the reach was the point all along. You will not do this perfectly. Nobody does. There will be moments when the old pattern wins, when the familiar smallness reasserts itself, when you leave a conversation wishing you had said something different. Those moments are not failures. They are data. They tell you where the old architecture is still load-bearing, where the work is still needed, where the next practice is waiting. What matters is the direction of travel. And the direction of travel, once chosen, once genuinely, privately, non-performatively chosen, has a way of holding. Because you cannot unsee what you have seen in these pages. You cannot unknow the compounding cost. You cannot unhear the pattern in your own language once you have heard it. You cannot unfeel the recognition of the moment when gratitude was weaponized against your own ambition. You have already seen too much to go back to not seeing it, which means the only direction available to you now is forward. Into rooms you enter differently, conversations you have differently, offers you respond to differently. A professional life that reflects not the earliest and most frightened version of your self-assessment, but the most current and most honest one. Somewhere in America tonight, someone is sitting with everything they have just heard, feeling the weight of years of an unclosed gap, and also quietly, for the first time in a long time, feeling something that might be the earliest edge of possibility. Not certainty, not a plan, just the beginning of a belief that things do not have to stay exactly as they have been. That beginning is enough. That beginning is, in fact, everything. Because the shift does not start when everything is figured out. It does not start when the fear is gone or when the timing is perfect, or when you have accumulated sufficient evidence that you deserve to take up the space you have always deserved to take up. It starts exactly here, in the quiet after the recognition, in the moment before the next choice, in the ordinary Tuesday that becomes, without announcement, the day something changed. You already know what you are worth. You have known for a while. The only question that remains, the only question that has ever really mattered, is whether you are finally ready to stop pretending you don't. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from working too hard, but from working too hard at being less than you are. It is a specific exhaustion, the kind that a full night of sleep does not touch, because it is not physical. It lives in the effort of constant self-diminishment, in the energy it takes, day after day, to hold yourself back from the clearer, fuller, more accurate version of who you are in your professional life. That tiredness is a signal, not of weakness, of readiness. The people who finally close the gap, not just the financial one, but the deeper one between their actual worth and how they move through the world, are almost never the ones who felt most confident at the start. They are the ones who got tired enough of the weight of the smaller version that the discomfort of changing it began to feel lighter than the cost of staying. You have been carrying something for a long time. You are allowed to set it down, not all at once, not without the occasional stumble back toward the familiar, but gradually, practice by practice, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. You are allowed to become, in your professional life, what you have always been in your capacity, someone whose value is real, whose contribution is genuine, and whose compensation reflects both. The world does not need another version of you that has learned to want less. It needs the version of you that finally stopped.